Steve here. It's the show where I answer your questions, and this week my first question comes from Patrick Dodds, who says, Steve, thanks for answering my question, but I also would like to know, how do you keep your mind sharp? Yes, Patrick asked me a question last week, and part of that question was, what do I do to keep my mind sharp? And I forgot to answer that part of the question. So clearly the answer is not enough. But more specifically, I don't really have a standard how to keep my mind sharp regimen. There's nothing specifically that I do, and I don't know if I'm even a very good example to be followed in that respect. I mean, I read a lot, I write a lot, I'm creative a lot, I talk to people a lot. I use my brain for a lot of things, mostly very, very basic things. But I'm just doing stuff a lot, so maybe that helps. I've also heard that physical exercise is very good for your brain and for keeping your mind sharp. So maybe I should try that. Maybe that's my problem. I should do more of that. Then my mind will be a little sharper and I'll remember to answer all of the question, not just part of the question next time. Phil James, Steve, do you think the social justice movement lacks a diversity of opinion? Is there a place for moderates on some issues in the social justice movement? Well, that would depend very much on the particular issue being addressed and on what is defined as the moderate position. I remember when I was a teenager, the moderate position on gay folks serving openly in the military was what eventually became the don't ask, don't tell policy, where the actual policy in the military of discharging people if they were found to be gay was not changed, but the implementation, the enforcement of the policy was changed so that it just wasn't discussed, and you could be gay, and as long as you didn't say anything about it, nobody knew, it was tolerated. And at the time, there were some gay rights activists who considered that a victory because it was better than the policy they had before. But then after the policy had been in place for many years and there didn't seem to be a lot of momentum behind changing it to just eliminate the ban on gay folks altogether, then people began to regard the don't ask, don't tell policy as a bad thing rather than a good thing. It had been the moderate position, it had been the compromise position, but once it became the entrenched position where it looked like that was just the way things were going to be, then it became unacceptable. And I think that's the use of moderation, of compromise positions in social justice movements. Absolutely, we have to be open to incremental change. If we can get 50% of what we want, that is better than 0%. It's not as good as 100%, and it doesn't mean that we should stop fighting for 100%, but if we can only get 50 this time around, then take the 50. Take the 75, take the 80, whatever you can get to get you towards your ultimate goal, take it. But then remember, don't just stay there. Stand from that spot and keep reaching for the 100%. If you start here and you want to get here, and you can only get here, well, then don't just stay here because you don't want here, you want here. Go up. Take the step that you can take, and then take a next step, and the next step, and the next step. Bruce Bardup, Steve, I am seasonal movie affective liminally louche, or small. It is a terrible condition which puts me in annual dread of holiday movie family-oriented scheduling decisions. This year I am small because Pride, the best little movie of 2014 in my humble opinion, is scheduled on BBC Two Boxing Day late night graveyard slot, while It's a Wonderful Life gets the after turkey primetime slot on the day itself. Do you get small? Family appropriateness. Pride features 60 seconds approximately of women showing healthy interest in gay porn, dildo in view. Humorous. It's a Wonderful Life, 36 to 38, normalized sexual coercion, Mary Bush robe. I'm clear which I'd rather small children watched. Yeah, I don't get small. I have a version of that where I sort of shake my head whenever you see a huge, massively marketed would-be Hollywood blockbuster, and then you see how difficult it is to get like an independent film made, or even if you are a relatively renowned established filmmaker, if you want to do a small project, it can be very difficult to get studio support for it or studio funding for it, because they would much rather throw $100 million at the marketing budget of the next hopefully big tentpole movie. But I'm glad you brought up that It's a Wonderful Life bit, because Jason and I, when we did our, Jason Harding and I, when we did our It's a Wonderful Life episode of our Late Seating podcast last week, and it was our special Christmas episode where it was a running commentary for the movie that you listen to as you watch the movie. And when we got to that scene of Mary losing her robe and hiding in the bushes, and George sort of toying with her and teasing her before he gives it back to her, I mean, yeah, that it's kind of a uncomfortable scene. I mean, it's played very aw shucks and very innocent, and George, of course, especially as portrayed as Jimmy Stewart, was, you know, not a malicious person or a threatening person at all. But still, like that scene, it's like, no, dude, just give her a robe, man. It's played as funny. It's supposed to be for a laugh. You're not supposed to read that much into it. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of the point of what you say, that it normalizes that kind of behavior, because it is such a light scene, because it is played as such a funny sort of, ha, isn't that cute sort of thing. It normalizes that kind of behavior. You know, a woman is hiding naked in the bushes, asking repeatedly for her robe, and the guy who holds her robe is willfully withholding it from her because he is entertaining himself with the situation. These sorts of issues crop up in things all the time. And even a film like It's a Wonderful Life, which overall I now consider to be a really great movie. A really great movie. A movie I would watch again. A movie that I admire and appreciate in many different ways. It still has that problem. It still has that scene that if I were writing it today, I might change. You know, doesn't mean the movie itself is terrible. Doesn't mean the movie itself should be chucked out into the garbage. It just means that we should be aware of these things. And we should be capable of being critical of something and of acknowledging its shortcomings, but also, but doing so in a way that we don't just throw the whole thing out. So just because you like the movie doesn't mean it's perfect. And just because you find an imperfection in the movie, it doesn't mean that it's terrible. Justin Parallax, here's a question for you, Steve. I watched Rogue One and felt pretty much the same way as you did. Enjoyed it a lot, especially where it moved away from what we expect of Star Wars and became its own thing. I'm not a fan of Star Wars as it is, so viewing this and actually getting into it was a real treat. But one thing left me thinking afterwards, and it was the use of the likeness of Peter Cushing. In full credit, the CGI likeness for him was very impressive, but it left me wondering about the impact of this. It raises a lot of ethical questions. Does a studio have the right to use the likeness of someone who has passed away and cannot give their consent? It's a massive step up from completing a film in which an actor passed away mid-production, such as The Crow with Brandon Lee or Oliver Reed in Gladiator, as the actor in question didn't even have a choice if they wanted to appear in the film in the first place. Robin Williams signed his likeness to a trust protection, which would prevent a studio from using his face and voice in this manner. But what of actors who have, like Peter Cushing, passed on before this type of technology could even have been dreamed of? I worry that Hollywood may have opened an ethical Pandora's box here. Yeah, so do I. And I wonder why there isn't more discussion about this. I don't know if maybe you've noticed more than I have, but I haven't heard a lot of people discussing this in these terms. I remember, again, I'll go back to when I was a teenager, and there was the short-lived phenomenon of using dead celebrities in TV commercials. You know, there was a beer commercial that used footage from an old John Wayne movie and redubbed the dialogue and animated him a little bit so that it appeared as though John Wayne were appearing in a beer commercial, even though he died in 1980. And there was Fred Astaire dancing with like the vacuum cleaner, and there was a Coke commercial that showed repurposed footage of Cary Grant from a movie, like pouring a Coke, and people at the time when that came out, they were like, that doesn't seem right. That seems kind of ghoulish and kind of disrespectful to these dead people who did not consent to appear in a commercial, and yet here we are mining their images for that. And with, Peter Cushing being resurrected through CGI in Rogue One, I think it's a similar thing. You could say, yeah, but it's not a commercial. He's a character in a story, and it's at least in part a creative exercise, and it's a little different than just resurrecting him to hawk pancakes or whatever. But it's still the issue of Peter Cushing agreed to portray Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars. He didn't agree, as far as I know, to portray Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars and any hypothetical future productions, even those that might take place after his death. You know, he didn't consent to allowing his image to be used in the movie, and yet there it is. And, you know, there's the question of, yes, but technically it's not Peter Cushing appearing in Rogue One, it's Grand Moff Tarkin, who just happens to look like Peter Cushing because Peter Cushing is the actor who portrayed him in the film. So you could say, well, it's not Peter Cushing, it's Grand Moff Tarkin. And, you know, the owners of the Star Wars intellectual property own Grand Moff Tarkin, and they can do whatever they want with them. And if they can make action figures with Peter Cushing's face on them in the likeness of Grand Moff Tarkin, then why can't they use computer wizardry to make the character come back in a movie, to resurrect Grand Moff Tarkin for a movie? What's the difference? And it's a very tricky issue, honestly, and I think we're right to raise it and to discuss it. And I am sort of curious as to why there hasn't been more discussion of it. Could it be that perhaps culturally we're just moving past that? We're just more okay with it now than we were when I was a kid and it was being used in beer commercials and Coke commercials. Maybe we've just gotten to a place where we're not as bothered by it culturally as we used to be. And if that's the case, I mean, good for folks like Disney who want to do that in their movies, but I'm not sure how I feel about that, if that is the case. Crow Bro, hey Steve, I'm an atheist skeptic living in Canada. There isn't much of a Christian right here, but the belief in New Age woo-woo and alternative medicine is exploding. I've been seeing friends online talking about getting Reiki, cupping, acupuncture, and so on. Most of the time I don't care, I just giggle to myself seeing suckers waste money on useless crap. But sometimes I see people with genuine medical problems using alternative medicine. I do my best to explain nicely that there is no evidence that any of it works. I met with a lot of hostility. I once was even called racist for saying it. I'm not sure what to do. Should I let people continue using alternative medicine or keep speaking up? Thanks. I think it's right for you to speak up, as long as you're doing it in a respectful way. I don't see a problem with that. I would probably feel compelled to do the same thing. I mean, the way I approach the issue is from the standpoint of someone who is against people being exploited. And if a person is spending their money on alternative medicine and a vendor of alternative medicine is giving them or is promising them that this treatment will help them in some way, will help to ease their affliction, will do something for them that it will not do, then the transaction that is taking place is fraud. Look, if they're set in their ways and they're determined to do it, I mean, you can't take the money out of their hand. You can't lock their wallet up. I mean, it's their money. If ultimately they decide to, you know, make use of alternative medicine, as useless as it is, that's their right. You have to respect their right to do it. So I wouldn't push too hard, you know, but I would definitely raise my voice. I would definitely mention it and make my objections known, make my concern for them known. Yeah, I think it's completely appropriate to do that. Funky Daniel UK. Steve, I've heard you say that there is a lot of disagreement and discussion in feminist circles about various issues, so it is unfair that people accuse them of being an echo chamber. I understand that you consider some issues, like is the feminist movement too fundamental to disagree on, and so don't want to engage with those, but could you give some examples of feminists you disagree with but don't entirely reject from the movement? What issues in feminism, intersectional, progressive politics you disagree about, and if you were able to resolve those issues. There are what are known as trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or which are called TERFs, and there are also SWERFs, which are sex worker exclusionary. There's a lot of disagreement within feminism. There's, you know, between second wave feminists and third wave feminists, but also within those waves. You know, there are feminists who you would describe or would describe themselves as second wave, who disagree with each other about, for instance, pornography, who disagree with each other about sex work. There are feminists who would all consider themselves or could be labeled accurately as third wave feminists who disagree with each other. about those issues. There's a lot of disagreement about whether or not pornography is a good thing, whether it is necessarily exploitative of women, or whether it can be used for something positive and healthy. Sex work, whether it is necessarily exploitative of women, or whether it can be something that is positive and healthy. Whether the best way to deal with exploitation of sex workers is to legalize sex work, or ban it, or be, more legally harsh on it. There are all kinds of disagreements among feminists about these issues. And my own personal opinions of these issues have changed a great deal as I have interacted more with feminists, and as I have encountered different points of view and heard from people who have had very different experiences. But others who are feminists, who have, probably much more of a right to claim that title than I do, disagree with me, disagree with a lot of us about that. And that's fine. I mean, I think they're wrong. I think they are on the wrong track and that they are offering the wrong solution, but they're still feminists and they're still part of the feminist community. Terry James, do you agree with the Noam Chomsky principle that citizens have a responsibility to focus on the crimes of their own nations more so than the crimes of the bad guys, and that if you want to stop terrorism, stop participating in it? I think that's a very sound principle. And you can call it many different things. It's sometimes called the clean hands doctrine. Jesus refers to it in the New Testament when he says, don't worry about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a plank in your own eye. And I think it's a very sound principle. If we are expecting our neighbor to clean up his house, but we are standing in the front yard of our house that is piled high with garbage, is perhaps the reason we are focusing on our neighbor's problems rather than our own, because we just don't feel like putting in the work to clean up our garbage. That's the problem with it, is it's so much easier to call out other people, especially people in entirely different communities or entirely different parts of the world, on their problems than it is to admit that we have problems here and to direct our energies toward cleaning up our own problems, toward fixing our own issues. It's very important that we do that. If we claim the right to identify the shortcomings, the problems, the crimes of other places, of other communities, and to demand that they fix those problems, then we must be willing, just as willing, I would say even more willing, to identify those same sorts of issues within our own places, to identify our own shortcomings, our own prejudices, our own biases, our own crimes, and be willing to face those and correct those ourselves. It's so much easier to demand that someone else handle their shit than it is to force ourselves to seriously and effectively handle our shit. Joe McClory, just watched your 5 things about 2016. Think you can come up with 5 positive things about this trash fire of a year? Actually, Joe, I have accepted your challenge, and in fact, I went through, just sort of scanned news items from the last year, and I have identified, actually, if you go item by item, it's way more than 5 good things about 2016, but it's 5 sort of general categories of good things that happened in 2016 with examples, and I wrote them down in my script here, so I hope you will forgive me from reading this. But first of all, I mean, we all talked about how crappy some of the movies were, but there were some really great movies this year, and there were even some really great blockbuster movies this year, like Captain America Civil War was great, Star Trek Beyond, Rogue One. We had a great Star Trek movie and a great Star Wars movie this year. Like, you can't say that for very many years. Moving on to more important issues, perhaps, this year also saw some gains in diversity in government here in the United States. Ilhan Omar was elected to the Minnesota state legislature. She becomes the first Somali American, she's actually a Somali refugee, to be elected to the legislature anywhere in the United States. That's great. That's a big deal. Who else? Catherine Cortez Masto was the first Latina elected to the United States Senate this year. That's an awesome bit of good news. In the space race, the space exploration sort of news, the Juno spacecraft reached Jupiter this year and entered orbit around Jupiter, and will be doing flybys and close studies of Jupiter. That's incredibly exciting. And there was also the discovery of an Earth-like exoplanet orbiting Proxima Centauri, the nearest star to the Earth. That was a huge deal. Really, really good, exciting news from this year. In politics, President Obama became the first sitting American president to visit Hiroshima, and that was followed just a couple of days ago, actually, by Prime Minister Abe of Japan becoming the first sitting Japanese prime minister to visit the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. So those very significant historic events. And then perhaps most importantly of all, for American political social stuff, the Pentagon announced that it was ending its ban on trans folks serving openly in the military. That's a huge deal. I mentioned in an earlier answer to a previous question how in the 90s, don't ask, don't tell was considered the compromised position and was sort of like considered progress. And now here we are, 2016, and what in many ways was a terrible, terrible year. And yet one of the things that happened this year was the United States military announced that it will no longer prohibit trans people from serving in the military. That's a pretty big deal. So that's a good thing about this year. I would definitely chalk that up with the good news from 2016. And of course, the best news of all for the present circumstance is that sound signifies that it's the end of this first round of the video, and it is time for the next round of questions, which is a little something I like to call
the lightning round.
Ahoy, year, no question. Last time I'm going to brag about being a father, but as an atheist, I really have to ask, what's a good recipe for preparing babies? I really don't want to, but I feel like I'm going to lose atheist cred if I don't eat her. Well, if you want to go a little bit outside the box, because everybody goes like ribs or burgers, I mean, get yourself a good enchilada recipe and just use some ground baby meat, in the place of like ground beef. That's what I would go for. Something with a little bit more flair to it, Francois Lacombe, concerning Roe v. Wade, I thought the only way to overturn a Supreme Court decision was to go the way of a constitutional amendment. So Roe v. Wade should be relatively safe from a Trump administration. Am I wrong about that? Oh, unfortunately, yes. Supreme Court decisions can be overturned by subsequent Supreme Court decisions. No constitutional amendment process is necessary. So yes, unfortunately, Roe v. Wade is extremely imperiled by the prospect of a Trump-selected Supreme Court. Joshua Purvis. Hi, Steve. My question is, what are some of your favorite superhero movies and heroes? Thanks, Steve. I enjoy your podcast. Well, thank you, Joshua. My taste in pretty much everything is very middle of the road and unremarkable. So, my favorite superheroes, it would be like Batman, Superman, Spider-Man. My favorite superhero movies, I think everybody knows I love Superman Returns, Spider-Man 2, Ang Lee's Hulk. Those are some of my favorites. I have a great deal of love for just sort of reassuring, heroic, life-affirming, exciting, fun superhero movies. So those, Superman 2 starring Christopher Reeve, Superman and the Mole Men with George Reeves. There's a lot of, The Dark Knight. Fairly popular stuff, except for Superman Returns and Ang Lee's Hulk, which a lot of people don't like, because a lot of people don't know what the fuck is good. Vitamin W, last week you said you could follow a religion without believing if it makes your life better. What do you think about Buddhism? People have asked me this before. It seems fine. It doesn't seem like my cup of tea. It doesn't seem like anything I feel particularly drawn to or that I feel like I need. But if it does something for somebody else, it's fine with me. I see no reason to object to it. People can do whatever they want. Buddhism seems fine. Lucas Hackett, One Angry Brony. Steve, I got a problem. Somebody ate all my cough drops, and I want to find out the sucker who did it. The problem is that I'm too sick with a sore throat for the past couple of weeks. Who do you think should I hire to beat them up for me? Scorpion from Mortal Kombat, or the masked merc with a mouth, Deadpool? Well, Deadpool would probably be a lot more entertaining to watch, but I think if you're going to hire someone to do a job for you, you're going to go with Scorpion. Because, for one thing, Scorpion can find the guy who stole your cough drops. He can drag him, into your house and say, okay, wait outside, go into your bedroom, and he walks in and he's like, hey, I found the guy. I think this is the guy who stole your cough drops. You want to talk to him now or later? And if you're not feeling up to it, you can say, I'll talk to him later. But if you're feeling up to it and you say, yes, Scorpion, I want to talk to him now, Scorpion doesn't even have to leave the room to go get him. He can just go, hey, get over here, and just, harpoon him and drag him right into the room for you. You can paintbrush him, do whatever you want, and that's the end of it. Dylan Jones, what is your favorite Bruce Springsteen song? Mine's Born in the USA because it reminds me of my dad. He fought in Desert Storm, worked at an oil refinery, a prison, and has got screwed by the VA. Well, I'm sorry to hear about that. My favorite Bruce Springsteen song is Atlantic City. The original version from Nebraska, the acoustic version from his album Nebraska. I love Atlantic City. I think it's a beautiful song. I've heard many different versions of it, and I've liked them all. Levon Helm did a really good version of it as well, but my favorite is still the original from Nebraska. NYC Guy. Hi, Steve. What do you think about universal basic income? Elon Musk says we may need this as robots take over more jobs. I am a huge supporter of universal basic income. I did a 5 things video about it earlier this year in support of it. I think I've answered questions about it in this series before. I am a big proponent of universal basic income, and so was my favorite American founding father, Thomas Paine. He advocated universal basic income 220 years ago, and we still haven't done it. We should listen to Thomas Paine and implement universal basic income. I am 100% in favor of it. I think it's a great idea. That's it for the lightning round. That's it for the questions. It's time for the shout out. And you know, people have mentioned, since we're drawing to the end of the year, what a shitty year 2016 has been. The good news I mentioned in an answer to an earlier question aside. And I mean, 2016 has been kind of a heavy year, kind of a shitty year. So I wanted to end 2016 with a shout out to someone who is someone that I don't think I discovered him originally this year, but I started really paying attention to his work and reading and listening to his work this year. And he's someone who's relatively well known in the skeptical community. Doesn't really need my help. He's famous enough already, but damn it, I don't care because I really enjoy his stuff. And so the shout out this week in honor of putting a good ending, or ending on a good note, this terrible fucking year of 2016. I'm recommending to you, if you've never heard of him or never experienced his work before, Dan Arel. Dan is an author. He's written a couple of books. Dan is an author of books such as Parenting Without God and The Secular Activist. He is a journalist and a columnist, and he is also a blogger at Danthropology, and he's also the host of a podcast called Danthropology, and Dan is just good people. He's a great progressive humanist voice that I am very, very grateful for. And if you don't know his work, I would highly recommend that you check out Dan, because he is the shout out of this week, and he is someone that you can read and listen to, and hopefully he will be as valuable of a voice to you as he has become this year to me. So thank you, Dan, and that's the shout out, Dan Arel. Go check out his stuff. Hey, I also want to remind, as I always do around this time, to check out the Lemme Listen family of podcasts. These are podcasts that are created, produced, hosted in most cases by my very good friend Jason with a Harding. Jason with a Harding? What the fuck am I talking about? Jason with a D. Jason Harding, aka Jason with a D. Jason with a Harding. It's Jason and Tanya Harding. No relation, but they were just together. So he is the mastermind behind a whole family of podcasts, a whole plethora of podcasts, and they include the original Lemme Listen podcast, which is Lemme Finish, co-hosted with Finite Atticus. There's also American Monsters and How to Destroy Them, the hilarious improv comedy podcast. There is a Filmtastic Voyage, which is hosted by Mike and Alex. There is Cinetific, which is a podcast that examines the scientific validity of popular films. And then there is, of course, Late Seating, which is co-hosted by Jason with a Steve, which is me. And this is the movie review podcast where we look at classic films, we give them a fresh review, we decide whether or not they deserve their reputations, whether those reputations are for good or for bad. And as I have already mentioned a couple of times in this video, our most recent episode is our Christmas episode, which is a special film commentary that you listen to while you watch It's a Wonderful Life. So get your copy of It's a Wonderful Life. You can rent it on Amazon or pop in your DVD, whatever, and you listen to our commentary as you watch it, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. We really had a good time making it. I think it turned out really well. I listened to it myself last week, and it works. Like, it syncs up and it makes sense. So check it out. You can go and listen to that episode. You can listen to all of the past episodes of Late Seating and all of the past episodes of all of the excellent Lemme Listen podcasts by going to LemmeListenPodcast.com. That's it for me, everybody. I am out of here. This is my last video of the year. It's been a good year, hasn't it? No, really it hasn't. But thank you all for sticking with me. Thank you for being with me for 2016. And let's keep doing this in 2017, shall we? Thanks, everybody, for your questions, for your comments. If you want to leave a question for the next video in this series, then leave a comment and ask me your question. You can ask me anything about anything. Nothing is too serious. Nothing is too silly. I will answer as many of your questions as I possibly can in the next video. So until then, take care. Hey folks, one more thing before I go. If you thought this video was worth watching, please like, share, and subscribe. And also, please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next year.